Carnival of Souls. In 1962, industrial filmmaker Herc Harvey stepped outside corporate training reels to direct his only feature film, a low-budget psychological horror called Carnival of Souls. Shot in just 3 weeks for around $33,000, it leaned heavily on eerie realism, using actual abandoned locations like Utah's decaying Saltaire Pavilion instead of studio sets. The film starred Candice Hilligoss, a little-known actress whose detached performance would later be called hypnotic, but at the time the film was a ghost, barely released, barely reviewed, and quickly forgotten. Some argue its unconventional pacing and surreal tone made it too strange for early 60s audiences still accustomed to gothic monsters and studio polish. Others point to a distribution blunder. Due to a copyright oversight, the film slipped into the public domain, leaving it with no marketing push and no studio backing. Ironically, that same error may have saved it. In the 1970s, TV stations hungry for late-night content began airing it regularly. A cult following emerged. Directors like George A. Romero and David Lynch later cited it as a key influence. Lynch for its disorienting dream logic, Romero for its undead imagery. By the time the Criterion Collection added it in 2000, Carnival of Souls had become a touchstone of art house horror. Yet its lead actress, Hilligoss, claimed the industry never came calling again. Some venture that the film's failure to fit the mold cost her more than just momentum. It erased her from Hollywood's memory. Today, the film is often studied for its haunting minimalism and psychological unease, but for decades it was a masterpiece hiding in plain sight. Eyes Without a Face. Released in 1960, Eyes Without a Face baffled critics and scandalized censors. Directed by Georges Franju, co-founder of the Cinémathèque Française, the film follows a brilliant surgeon who kidnaps women to graft their faces onto his disfigured daughter. Its surgical scenes, shot with eerie restraint, reportedly caused fainting spells at the Edinburgh Film Festival. British censors sliced nearly 5 minutes from the runtime, while rumors swirled that Italian authorities barred it for being too grotesque. Franju described the project as a poem of blood, a phrase that captures its unsettling mix of lyrical beauty and clinical horror. Composer Maurice Jarre's haunting score and Edith Scobb's porcelain mask added to its surreal tone, which clashed sharply with genre norms of the time. Initially dismissed as tasteless or exploitative, the film was largely ignored by mainstream critics, though some maintain its cold detachment and surgical precision quietly formed the blueprint for later body horror. Film historians now credit it with influencing a wave of stylized horror decades later, though it took until the 1980s for scholars to begin championing its artistry. Once a cultural outcast, it's now a festival staple and Criterion Collection gem. Still too strange to be mainstream, but finally recognized as a cornerstone of avant-garde horror. Dead of Night. Released in September of 1945, just weeks after the official end of World War II, Dead of Night emerged from British studio Ealing as a quiet disruptor in horror cinema. While most films of the era leaned on gothic castles or supernatural monsters, this one turned inward, toward psychological unease. Structured as a horror anthology, it stitched together 5 eerie tales inside a looping narrative, a format rarely seen in horror at the time. The ending? A recursive nightmare where the protagonist wakes up only to relive the same chilling events again and again. Critics and audiences were left puzzled, but intrigued. One segment in particular, featuring a ventriloquist and his disturbingly autonomous dummy, left a lasting scar on the genre. Michael Redgrave's portrayal of the unraveling performer set the gold standard for the evil dummy archetype. The dummy Hugo didn't just move on its own, it hinted at a deeper fear, the loss of control over one's mind. No gore, no jump scares, just pure psychological erosion. For an audience fresh out of wartime trauma, that hit close to home. Despite its innovation, Dead of Night never received proper theatrical distribution in the United States. While British critics praised it as a masterpiece, American audiences barely knew it existed. Some propose its cerebral tone and ambiguous structure made it a tough sell in a market that preferred more linear horror. Others murmur that its unsettling themes clashed with post-war optimism. Still, its influence seeped in quietly. Shows like The Twilight Zone, which debuted in 1959, and later anthology horrors like Tales from the Crypt echoed its fragmented storytelling and mind-bending twists. Though no direct line connects them, many critics consider Dead of Night a spiritual predecessor. Even Martin Scorsese has called it one of the scariest films he's ever seen. That's high praise for a film that never needed a monster to terrify. It simply asked what happens when the mind turns on itself. The Innocence. In a decade crowded with gothic castles, rubber-suited monsters, and Hammer's crimson theatrics, one film dared to unsettle instead of shock. Released in 1961, Jack Clayton's The Innocence delivered psychological horror with surgical precision. Based on Henry James's 19th century novella The Turn of the Screw, it cast Deborah Kerr as a governess convinced her young wards are haunted. But the real terror? The film never confirms if the ghosts are real, or if she's spiraling into delusion. Working with cinematographer Freddie Francis, Clayton turned every frame into a trap. CinemaScope and stark, black-and-white visuals stretched shadows to unnatural lengths, while deep focus dared audiences to spot something, anything, lurking in the background. Critics praised its elegance, but it was largely eclipsed at the box office by louder, bloodier fare. As film historian David J. Schall pointed out, subtlety rarely sells in horror. The Innocence faded into the background, quietly gathering dust while Dracula and Frankenstein soaked up the spotlight. Over time, though, its influence grew. Directors like Guillermo del Toro and Alejandro Amenabar have openly cited it as a key inspiration. And others hypothesize that Stanley Kubrick studied its structure while developing The Shining. Add to that the chilling performances of child actors Martin Stevens and Pamela Franklin, and The Innocence stands as a masterclass in dread without a single drop of blood. For years, it lingered in obscurity, but today, it's finally being recognized as one of the most unnerving films of its era. Dementia. Released in 1955, John Parker's Dementia bewildered audiences and senses alike. A dialogue-free horror film with no conventional plot, it leaned into surreal visuals and jarring sound design to explore a woman's descent into psychological chaos. The protagonist, unnamed and voiceless, wanders through a distorted cityscape, pursued by grotesque figures and echoing memories. While some modern viewers interpret the film as a metaphor for cognitive decline, its original intent appears rooted in broader themes of trauma and repression. It was banned in several US cities, including New York, for content deemed too disturbing. Film historian David J. Schall has noted that mid-century censors often cracked down on works that blurred fantasy and psychosis, fearing they might destabilize public perception. Dementia's subversion of gender norms didn't help its case either. The female lead, harassed by male authority figures, stood in stark contrast to the era's passive damsel archetype, a dynamic that some later scholars viewed as an early critique of patriarchal control. In 1957, the film was re-released under the title Daughter of Horror, with narration by future Tonight Show announcer Ed McMahon. The addition was meant to clarify the film's abstract narrative, though some fans argue it stripped away its eerie mystique. Word has it that actress Adrienne Barrett privately expressed disapproval, allegedly calling the new version a betrayal of its original vision. Though it vanished from the spotlight for decades, Dementia quietly gained cult status. David Lynch has acknowledged its influence on his work, and while no direct quote ties it to Eraserhead, the stylistic parallels are hard to ignore. The film has since been restored and reissued by several boutique labels, reigniting interest in its nightmarish, genre-bending legacy. Once dismissed as incoherent, Dementia now stands as a bold outlier, decades ahead of its time and still unsettling in the best way. The Seventh Victim. In 1943, as Hollywood leaned into patriotic war dramas, RKO discreetly introduced a psychological time bomb. The Seventh Victim, produced by Val Lewton and directed by Mark Robson, eschewed monsters and mayhem in favor of something far more unsettling: existential dread, ritualistic cults, and a protagonist who embraces death rather than salvation. One of the first American films to depict a satanic cult, known here as the Paladists, it offered no clear villain, no tidy resolution, and certainly no comfort. The group's motives remained murky, and that ambiguity only deepened the unease. Film historian Edmund G. Bansack noted Lewton's philosophy: horror should creep in through atmosphere and implication. Here, that ethos hits its darkest note. Cinematographer Nicholas Musaraka drenched the film in shadow and silence, crafting a visual language that prefigured the psychological unease later seen in films like Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby in 1968. Gossip even claims that some scenes were toned down post-production due to concerns from RKO executives worried the film was too bleak for wartime audiences. It didn't help at the box office. Outshone by Luton's more accessible hits like Cat People, The Seventh Victim faded fast. But decades later, critics began to revisit its nihilistic tone, calling it a precursor to the horror renaissance of the late 1960s. Today, it stands as a buried classic, too quiet for its time, but impossible to forget once unearthed. The Tingler. In 1959, William Castle unleashed The Tingler, a film that shocked audiences more with its seats than its storyline. Castle, already known for turning theaters into carnival rides, installed vibrating devices under select chairs and called the gimmick Percepto. During a key scene, the screen went black. Vincent Price's voice warned that the creature had escaped, and suddenly the seats began to buzz. Some panicked, others laughed, but nearly everyone remembered it. While critics scoffed, Variety reportedly dismissed it as a gimmick in search of substance, Castle leaned into spectacle. But beneath the buzzers and blackout effects, The Tingler tackled surprisingly dark ideas. Fear as a literal parasite, repression as a killer. The creature itself, a centipede-like organism that grows inside the spine when fear is suppressed, was a metaphor more unsettling than its rubbery design. The film even featured what some film historians consider one of the earliest depictions of an LSD trip on screen, controversial at the time, especially since the drug was still legal in the United States. Castle's flair for showmanship often buried these subtexts, but modern critics have revisited the film with fresh eyes. Some suggest Castle was using horror to explore post-war anxieties and emotional repression in Cold War America. The Tingler may not have won awards, but it electrified audiences, literally, and helped redefine horror as a participatory experience. Today it's recognized as a cult milestone, and a cornerstone of Castle's legacy as the genre's most theatrical provocateur. Corridors of Blood. In a decade overflowing with radioactive beasts and technicolor vampires, one film dared to explore horror with a scalpel instead of screams. Corridors of Blood. Released in the United Kingdom in 1958, this British production starred Boris Karloff as Dr. Thomas Bolton, a Victorian-era surgeon obsessed with eliminating the agony of surgery, long before the widespread use of anesthesia. While the film was shot and completed in 1958, MGM delayed its American release until 1962, reportedly fearing that its grim, medically grounded theme would clash with the more sensational horror trends dominating US theaters. Some insist the delay was also tied to Karloff's waning box office pull in the States, though no official reason was ever confirmed. Either way, the film's slow rollout buried it under the rising tide of Hammer Horror's blood-soaked spectacles. But Corridors of Blood carved out its own legacy. Critics later praised its unflinching portrayal of pre-anesthetic surgery, complete with historically accurate restraint techniques and volatile ether use. Some film scholars argue it even foreshadowed the psychological unease of David Cronenberg's body horror decades later. It wasn't about monsters in the shadows. It was about the terrifying cost of progress under bright surgical lights. In a genre often defined by fantasy, Corridors of Blood stood out by confronting a very real fear. What happens when science cuts too deep? Horror Hotel. In 1960, the British horror film The City of the Dead quietly emerged, later rebranded for American audiences as Horror Hotel, a name some argue dulled its eerie tone. Featuring Christopher Lee and set in the cursed village of Whitewood, the story weaves 17th century witch trials into a modern-day tale of vengeance. Desmond Dickinson's cinematography drowned the town in fog, crafting a dreamlike claustrophobia. The film's boldest move comes midway, when the apparent protagonist, a student researching witchcraft, is abruptly killed off, predating a similar shock in Hitchcock's Psycho that same year. Though it drew some critical attention, Horror Hotel faced backlash in the United States, allegedly pulled from theaters after religious protests over its occult themes, an unsurprising outcome in a Cold War climate wary of the supernatural. Overshadowed by Hammer Horror's vivid spectacles, its stark monochrome style and methodical pacing kept it on the margins. Yet as decades passed, late-night TV revivals and horror retrospectives sparked a reappraisal. Critics began to link it to later folk horror staples like The Wicker Man, noting shared motifs of isolation and paganism. Its reliance on atmosphere over gore is now seen as a quiet precursor to genre shifts that favored mood and myth over spectacle. Though nearly forgotten in its time, Horror Hotel has endured as a ghostly cult relic, proof that even low-budget chillers can cast long shadows. The Man They Could Not Hang. In August of 1939, Columbia Pictures released The Man They Could Not Hang, a quietly unsettling horror film starring Boris Karloff as Dr. Henrique Savard, a scientist executed for murder after reviving a corpse without consent, only to be brought back to life himself. What followed wasn't a rampage of madness, but a calculated, chilling vendetta against the jury and officials who condemned him. Unlike Karloff's more famous monster roles, this was horror rooted in moral ambiguity rather than the supernatural, blending science, ethics, and revenge in a grimly reflective tale. While Son of Frankenstein from Universal leaned into gothic spectacle that same year, Columbia's film offered a stark, cerebral alternative. The Man They Could Not Hang marked the beginning of a trilogy of Karloff's Mad Doctor films for Columbia, followed by Before I Hang in 1940 and The Devil Commands in 1941. These stories replaced monsters with meditations on justice and human limits, with Karloff's performances, described by historian Gregory Mank as carrying a sorrowful dignity, offering rare emotional depth. Overshadowed by Universal's branding power and too somber for audiences seeking thrills, the film quietly faded despite its provocative themes. Yet in recent years it has resurfaced through restorations and retrospectives, now recognized as a spiritual ancestor to ethics-driven horror like Reanimator and Flatliners. No castles, no capes, just a haunting parable about science, consequence, and the fine line between brilliance and vengeance. The Undying Monster. In 1942, as Universal Pictures basked in the glow of its iconic monsters, 20th Century Fox quietly released The Undying Monster, a gothic horror detective hybrid directed by John Brom. Centered on a cursed British bloodline and a beast that strikes under the full moon, the film was largely overlooked upon release, dismissed as a lesser werewolf tale in the shadow of the Wolfman. Yet it offered a striking alternative. Lucian Ballard's moody cinematography rivaled Universal's finest, and its narrative leaned into science over superstition, with a medical examiner probing the mystery through biology and psychology. This empirical slant, rare for its time, has since been credited by critics like Kim Newman as ahead of its era, blending rationalism with spectral lore. Though a box office underperformer with no sequels to follow, The Undying Monster lingered in obscurity until horror enthusiasts rediscovered it via late-night television and worn VHS tapes in the 1980s. Today, it's considered one of the few non-Universal lycanthrope films from the 1940s to push genre boundaries. Its mist-shrouded visuals and logic meets legend approach earning retroactive praise. While it never achieved the cult fame of Cat People, its subtle influence can be traced in later genre crossovers, from The Fly to The X-Files. An atmospheric outlier in a decade dominated by cloaks and claws, it remains a curious footnote in horror history, quietly expanding the monster movie blueprint. The Leopard Man. In 1943, while Hollywood's horror machine churned out monsters and makeup, RKO quietly dropped a film that broke the mold, The Leopard Man. Produced by Val Lewton and directed by Jacques Tourneur, the movie ditched gore in favor of mood, silence, and shadows. It followed the success of Cat People, but unlike its predecessor, The Leopard Man leaned even harder into ambiguity. One scene, often cited in film studies, features a girl locked out during a tense moment. No blood, no creature, just a chilling fade to black. That restraint became its signature. Some film historians have floated the idea that this minimalist approach helped shape the DNA of future psychological slashers. While the budget was modest, reportedly around $150,000, its influence far outpaced its box office. Rumors even suggest Hitchcock screened Lewton's films while crafting Psycho. And though The Leopard Man rarely makes top horror lists from the Golden Age, its stripped-down suspense and eerie tone left fingerprints on everything from Halloween to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. A proto-slasher before the term existed, it's a film that whispered when others screamed, and that whisper still echoes. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.